The reading from the Apocalypse invites us to look up, and indeed the whole context of this feast does the same. Even the prayers invite us to be somewhat distant with regard to the material and the passing. I was looking by chance one day at a book of history, unfortunately, from the period of the Second World War, while doing something in Drogheda. It was in a bookshop there, Eason's, and there were frightening pictures. One hit me particularly strongly. It was just an ordinary soldier on the edge of a large pit, which obviously he and his fellow soldiers had been obliged to dig, and he had at his head a gun, and he didn't look too pleased, and one sensed that he was breathing his last and about to join the others in that pit underneath, who a few seconds earlier had also been alive. And as I looked on that, I thought what death is about. One moment here and one moment there. And I thought to myself, as I looked at the look on this man's face, how perhaps he wasn't prepared, what was going on in his mind as he stood there before his own eternity, because at that point one is bound at least to vaguely be aware that there might be something ahead. This feast is the feasting of the most glorious member of our race, who had none of the consequences of our original sin, and therefore was glorified also in her body. I would like to think of three cases of very different ends, which have been coming to me in the course of this day. They will help us to reflect on what might be our situation by anticipation, for a feast of this nature should invite us to think also of the eternal optic and of our last end, which is also our beginning. Again, in the context of war, but going back a generation, yesterday it made me think about it because I had to go back to Wales to see my mother, who was going down a bit. And so in the car with my brother, we were discussing a bit of family history, and the war came up twice, because my father was a German student in the period just leading up to the war, and he was living in Germany, and he was keen on maintaining the link with Helmut, his close friend. And at a certain point, because my brother was looking at the preserved correspondence that they had, he noticed that there were things changing. And he reminded me how, when we were children, we had gone back to try and find Helmut. We found the house all right. We found his mother all right. Dad delayed a little bit in the house. We didn't know what was going on, but then we were invited to go in as well. And they showed the sketch of Helmut on the piano. He was a very good musician and a cultivated man. He had been obliged to get involved with what he knew to be wrong, and seeing the way Germany was going, he had opted for an end to his own life under his own hands, rather than get involved with things which went against his conscience. That was the end of my father's friend. When I was about 15, we went to find the other friend that he was in close correspondence and staying with too. We found the farm eventually, and the man came to the door. It was the brother of my father's friend. My father's friend had died, of course, as a soldier. So my father had survived the war because he became ill on the way to, Burma, which would be atrocious had he got there. My grandfather survived the first war because he wasn't accepted because of one eye. He was going into the Marines. His brother was, and of course never came back. A grenade right in the head, in the trenches. Life is fragile. Life is sometimes very short, ending before it even starts. They say the flower of the English nation was lost, especially in the First World War. They went and never came back. But these are actually relevant thoughts on a day like this, because death and the use of life faces us all. We all have the same means of gaining glory, as our Blessed Lady actually: time, merit, prayer, penance, fidelity. The bottom line is the same for every human being in his innings on earth. Another case is that very different, which hit me just recently. I was asked by text to go, if I could, to the hospital down the road, to the Lord Hospital at Drogheda. There was a friend of ours officially dying. They could do no more with her, for her, the doctors had declared. In fact, one doctor had said, she's now in the hands of God. She was henceforth completely unconscious. She was in intensive care. And when I got there, I saw what that meant, plugged in all round, and one nurse to every patient, completely monitored every second, but not expected to even face reality again in a world of their own. I got there, and she had woken up. And she was able to make her own confession with great lucidity, receive a complete host and a continental host, the ones which I have here because they're bigger and I prefer them, which are nearly twice the size of our own. And she's only in her early 30s, but completely ridden with cancer, with a child, and to receive the sacrament of the sick and the apostolic indulgence for a person in articulo mortis, and also to communicate and even smile. I was told about the following day, or no, a few days later, I'm not sure, by somebody who appeared at Mass, she's actually been discharged. This is strange. I know the sacrament of the sick does have an effect, but what I was particularly touched by was what followed. She said, after you'd gone, she closed her eyes and she said that she could see Jesus. And she would see him again and again in that form, and they were asking her in what form? In the form of the Divine Mercy, as you have it. She was talking to her sister. I thought, wow, this is a great end or beginning or whatever's going on. She's still alive actually. I don't know what's going on there. But there are things happening in this point of the periphery between life and death which are quite strange, especially when the Lord is involved directly in the sacramental sphere. He cares big time for that moment. And again, that moment there, he sees it all over the planet. I remember talking to my father one day about what had actually been reported amongst the soldiers. And I had read it actually in print too. I think later on I heard this bit, that the Germans had said, when it came to the Second World War, there will be no miracle of the Marne. And that was something which had been all hush-hush. They weren't allowed to talk about it, but apparently my father knew about it. It was true. It was in the First World War, something strange had happened, showing that heaven was seeing all these soldiers and could see the mass of souls leaving the bodies in a short area, all in one moment, and is concerned and is involved. But apparently something inexplicable happened at one point. It was when they were about to obviously get dangerously close to Paris itself, and a complete and inexplicable thing happened. And apparently, and this is what the soldiers themselves communicated, but they weren't allowed to repeat it on the German side, they could see on the clouds, and my father affirmed something of that nature, yes, it had been seen, they could see, now, depending on which side they were on, it was Our Blessed Lady, actually, obviously, there, and she was saying to the French, you are not to go back any further, and to the Germans she was saying, thus far and no further. She was actually protecting, it would seem. And that was a great reversal, the miracle de la Marne, the miracle of the Marne. Now, these things are on a cosmic scale when it comes to something of that nature, when a very large number of souls about to cross the frontier of eternity are involved. Our Lady is very concerned, because each one is an eternity, and eternity is irreversible. Therefore, heaven is very much involved in the whole angelic world with a situation of that nature. But then, heaven is very much involved with the individual. Whenever a soul is in danger or is actually at the point of whatever may be the situation of the soul, any moment of potential encounter with eternity concerns the whole court of heaven. Old Nick, as we call him, is involved too, and he wants his pound of flesh. Any bit of that soul he's had, he wants it back at that time. And therefore, when it comes to people like yourselves, who are actually involved in front-line combat, because the Legion of Mary is precisely front-line combat, getting to places, if you like, the trenches, where the soldiers are able to go further than the officers. The priests can't go where you go. You're actually hitting people hard there where they're at, in their family situation. Wherever you meet them, you're actually doing the Lord's work, and He will give you the words. This is important ministry. And you can change a person's life by transmitting the word received from the Holy Spirit at that point. Invoke Him to give you the right word, not too many words, but the right one, which might just, without addressing, make a person reflect and want, and then they can be exposed to further truth. Because He's the only one who can get inside. But He needs our voice box. Providence is involved. I'll just finish with one thing that actually happened, and it really impressed me, to show how much a soul means and how much it should mean to us should we ever have a soul before us in this situation of being on the point of encounter, irreversibly so. It happened some years ago in London. People think of the Brompton Oratory as being very posh. Well, there may be an element of a certain type of person going there in prayer, perhaps. But the truth of the matter is that they are very, very good pastors of souls. And this soul was particularly good at his fishing. It was Father Patrick. He would go to the places where people were precisely in the trenches. I mean hospitals, places where there were people right on the point of leaving this world forever. Everyone mattered as though he were the only one to that priest. He was going from bed to bed, finding out who were the Catholics and so on. And he got to this gentleman who had abandoned all practice of the faith donkey's years previously. He started a dialogue with him. And your man wouldn't even start a dialogue. He could see what he was and what he wanted, and he was very dismissive and actually very rude. So Father Patrick tried to find a better way to get through, knowing the importance of the issue. He became more aggressive and more rude. He tried a third time, and he became quite aggressive and quite rude. And just wanted him to leave him in peace, because he was wasting his time altogether. But he wouldn't. He stood there and looked at him, and indeed looked straight at him in the eyes, until eventually the other one realized he was being looked at in the eyes, and just answered, "What are you looking at?" And at that point, Father Patrick said something which actually could have been quite dangerous, but obviously came from the Holy Spirit. He said, "I'm looking at you because I've never, ever, ever before looked into the eyes of a person who's going to hell." And with that he turned round and walked towards the door. Just getting to the end of the ward, he heard a faint call, "Father, come back a moment!" And so he came back and heard his confession. The right word, at the right time, can change all eternity. Amen. Shri